You're having too much fun back there.
I'm sure. Let's just go and see later.
You go alphabetical with the exception of these.
This is vice president's. Okay, so then we have to get Iraq to not be able to do that.
No, you don't. I'll change the name to stream once it starts anyway. So literally all you have to do at this point is 5 minutes before the meeting. Just it's 5 minutes before, and then just 1 and 2 minutes before this time.
So right now they're
mute.
Welcome to Hangouts Meet. Enter the meeting pin followed by the pound key. Thank you. Your pin doesn't match a meeting that's ready to start soon. Enter the meeting pin followed by the pound key. Welcome to Hangouts Meet. Enter the meeting pin followed by the pound. Thank you. You have joined the call, but you are the only one here.
Good morning, everybody. We're going to call our meeting to order. It's it's right around 9 o'clock, and we'd like to welcome the Alhambra High School Choir, and they're going to give us the Pledge of Allegiance and National Anthem, and then they are accompanied by their choir director, Kristen Rebb, and then that'll be followed by our opening prayer by Mr. Johnny Martin. So let's have the Alhambra High School Choir, and we'll go from there. Please stand.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose bright stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say just as our spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free, and the home of the brave.
Thank you, Mr. Martin.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Oh God, we thank you for this beautiful day here in Phoenix, Arizona. We thank you for the opportunity to gather together for a noble purpose, to improve the lives of students and teachers across this state as they undertake the important task of bettering our society, bettering the individual, bettering each other through our education. I thank you for the opportunity as a student to come here before elected leaders and public officials to offer an invocation of hope as we realize together all that we can accomplish for the children of the state, for those who've dedicated their lives to teaching, for every citizen who cares about our future and our present. God, we thank you for this wonderful opportunity and this wonderful day. And Lord, I ask that you would let each heart in this room understand that what we do need not be divisive or full of anxiety if we can remember that our neighbors want the best for us, and if we also can want the best for our neighbors. I pray this in the name of the one God from whom we all came, to whom we all return. In God's name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Mr. Martin. Thank you, Alhambra Choir, and thank you, Ms. Rebb. Roll call.
President Narducci,
Here.
Vice President Kaur, Superintendent Hoffman,
Here.
Member Baker,
Here.
Member Broussard, Member Burton,
Here.
Member Chang,
Here.
Member Kay,
Present.
Member Mack,
Here.
Member Ruiz,
Present.
Member Wellborn.
Present.
You have a quorum.
Thank you very much. We will move on to the agenda with business reports, and the President's report is short today. And welcome everybody, and welcome everybody in the audience. Today, the State Board of Education is meeting as the Arizona State Board for Vocational and Technical Education, and I have to announce that as a matter of requirement. However, when no items are on the agenda to discuss, we'll move on to the Superintendent's report.
Good morning. I also want to say welcome to everyone. I always like to balance out the short President's report with a longer Superintendent's report. So first, I wanted to recognize and congratulate Davis Bilingual Elementary School for being named one of the top 10 magnet schools in the country. I had the privilege and pleasure of visiting Davis Bilingual Elementary School a couple weeks ago, and I was completely blown away by the school's celebration of language and multiculturalism and its spirit of excellence. So congratulations to Davis and to Dr. Trujillo, as well as all of the students and educators in TUSD. I've also been traveling quite a bit this month. Last week I was in Yuma, and I visited 4 schools, also attended the County Superintendent's Luncheon, and saw some new and innovative middle school and high school CTE programs. For example, at 4th Avenue Junior High, they have partnered with a local construction company that donated materials to this school so that the middle school students were partnering with the construction company to build a new shed for their garden. It was just amazing. And so the company's employees are helping teach those carpentry skills and courses to the middle school students. So I love seeing that career and technical education program all the way down for our younger students as well. And also, I really appreciated seeing that connection between the local business and the school. I'd love to see that expanded as well. And while we're highlighting our amazing CTE programs, I also had the privilege of touring the Arizona Agribusiness and Equine Center, which is a charter school. I went to the South Phoenix campus last week, and as a high school senior, Jesus gave me a tour of the campus where they take equine science, vet tech courses, and plant science classes, and as well, all of starting at the freshman level, students start taking a storytelling course through the South Mountain Community College, which is next door, which I thought that was another amazing partnership between the local community college and the high school. And the student who gave me the tour, Jesus, is the president of the campus's FFA chapter. And he told me that since they do have this strong partnership with the community college, he is graduating high school with 3 associate degrees. That is just incredible. And he plans to attend ASU next year to study biochemistry. So it's very encouraging for me to hear about talented students like him continuing their education here in Arizona. I also have a few updates from our department. We recently had our second ESA task force meeting and wanted to update the public that we now have an active RFP for a new payment system for the ESA program. And this will increase the financial transparency, accountability, and service to parents. We have been working very closely with the Treasurer's Office on this open RFP, and we expect to have a decision made to select a new vendor by June. And as I said, we've been working closely with the Treasurer's Office as well as other ESA stakeholders, including parents, and we will be convening in June again to craft the rollout of the new payment system. And I'm really encouraged by the collaborative, very productive collaboration of this group. And I know there's some ESA task force members in the audience, so thank you for your participation in this group as well. And as we move forward with the budget process in the legislature, we in our agency have continued to be a champion for key pieces for our department's success. And as I've mentioned in prior meetings, this includes funding for a much needed update to our school finance IT technology here for the Department of Education. And wanted to note that our audit committee, which is continuing to meet regularly, is helping to inform the department on the direction of the build out for this new payout system. And the last thing I wanted to mention was another area we've been focused on in the department is having more cross-agency collaboration. And with over 500 staff team members in ADE, I invited anyone in the department to participate in a new, right now it's an internal group for mental health and social wellness topics. And I see that the stars are aligning on this, where we have our department really focused on how can we improve the social emotional well-being of students, as well as the governor's office. And we've also started partnering with Access on this topic. So with partnering with these other state agencies, we're exploring new ways to provide professional development to teachers in every county around the state. And this will include trauma-informed practices and classroom management skills types of professional development opportunities for our educators. So I'm really excited that with the direction of this new committee on social wellness. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Superintendent. Executive Director Williams.
President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members of the board, three things for you all today. First, as I just wanted to let the board members know that Kellen Wesley, who's over to my left, his last day will be Friday with board staff, and so we are very thankful that he has served with board staff for 2 years, and so we will be posting his position this week and hope to have that filled by the end of April. Wish him luck on his new endeavor. The board retreat. So we have found some dates. I've asked you to hold August 7th through the 11th. No, we're not having a retreat for all of those dates. I do think it would end up being the 9th and 10th of August, but I do want you just to hold those extended dates just in case something happens. Board staff is working with Dr. Chang's staff because we will be traveling all the way up to Flagstaff, taking our show on the road. So hold those dates, please. And I think with some retreat topics could include accountability, assessments, early literacy, educator discipline, and school improvement. So if you have some ideas of what you would like to discuss at the retreat, please send those my way, as staff will start working on developing the retreat, the topics, what you all will be doing, because I'm going to put you to work. So let me know if you think of something else.
Thank you. Thank you for anything else. Move on to agenda item number 2, and this is a time for the public to comment on the consent agenda. Director Williams, have we received any requests?
We have one request from Mark Jornstad.
Good morning, President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members of the board. George Bernard Shaw once indicated that the biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it's taken place. Well, I want to note today, I stand here to praise the efforts of 2 organizations to completely dispel that illusion. First of all, the Arizona Department of Education under its new leadership, both the superintendent and her right hand, John Caruth, have been exemplary in reaching out to various organizations throughout the state, working to solve problems before they become problems, to make the efforts of the department on behalf of our children very transparent and clear. And it just should really be noted that that's going on, and it's been very pleasant to work with. Secondly, on behalf of the State Board of Education, I want to point out that your Executive Director and your Deputy Director, Alicia Williams and Ketcher Baden, have similarly been very outgoing and collaborative in their efforts on behalf of various department and state board initiatives. They collaborate with the field. They make every effort to bring members in and make sure that they know what's going on, that they're not caught by surprise. And this kind of collaboration, not only between members of the profession and the state board, but between the state board and the department, can only work to the good of our students and our children, especially when we're dealing with things like A through F and the menu of assessments. These are critical issues, and this kind of collaboration, outreach, and transparency will really benefit the Arizona educational community and ultimately Arizona students, and they need to be commended for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Move on to, no more calls to the public, right? No more. We'll move on to agenda number 3. And agenda number 3 is our consent agenda. I'm assuming that all items have been reviewed by board members. And with that, do I have a motion to approve consent items 3A through 3H?
So moved.
We have a motion to approve. Do I have a second?
Second.
We have a second. Do I have any discussion? Can I have a vote? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any? Aye. Thank you, Cal. Any opposed? Okay, it's approved. Thank you. We'll move on to item number 4. Item number 4 is time for public comment on the general session items. Director Williams.
President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members of the board, we do have 4 requests to speak this morning, but I do want to note for the record that public comment from 2 letters from the College Board, 1 letter from ACT, and 1 letter from Mr. McRae have been submitted to the board, and you received those on Friday, so that will go into the record for today's meeting as well. First up, we have Brandon Crow, followed by Amanda Glass.
President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members of the board, good morning. My name is Brandon Crow. I'm the Executive Director for Upper Schools with Great Hearts Arizona, supporting our 11 high schools in the greater Phoenix metropolitan area. In June 2018, we made the decision as a network to choose the SAT from the menu of assessments. Over the course of the school year, our schools have been preparing for the SAT as the end-of-the-year exam administered in lieu of the AZ Merit exam. When we chose the SAT, we assumed that its place on the menu meant that all partners, especially the state board, the legislature, and the college board, had finalized everything necessary to ensure scores for the SAT would be meaningfully transferred into the A through F grading system that the state had recently adopted. What we've recently learned is that this is not the case. Great Hearts understands that this is not news to this body, but simply wanted to ask that should transferable cut scores not be possible for this year, this body recommend that any Arizona high schools having chosen the SAT be held harmless on the letter grades going into the next school year. This seems to us the most reasonable and fair solution. Additionally, we would like to ask that an update on recommended next steps going into the 1920 year be drawn up by the ADE and communicated as soon as possible. Thank you for your opportunity to address you, and on behalf of everyone at Great Hearts, thank you for considering this topic. We appreciate your service to the students and the families of the state of Arizona. Thanks.
Amanda Glass, followed by Doug McRae. It looks like Amanda Glass is not here, so Doug McRae, followed by Jeff Esposito.
Good morning, President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members of the board. My name is Doug McRae. I'm a retired testing publisher from Monterey, California, also a condo owner in the Phoenix area for family use and spring training. I've led the development of K-12 achievement tests administered to roughly 40% of the K-12 enrollments across the entire U.S., and I've advised the California State Board of Education on development and execution of a statewide assessment program that was in place from 1997 to 2013. Since retirement 10 years ago, I've continued to follow statewide testing programs across the country, serving on panels for the U.S. Department of Education, and providing frequent comments at the California State Board as well as occasional testimony in the legislature. My technical training was psychometrics. I submitted a 3-page handout for this comment last week, and I hope that the board has had the chance to review it. The handout sketches the history of so-called growth measures or growth models for the past 50 years, ending with current status. In short, following individual student growth across grades has been a holy grail for both test developers as well as test users for more than 50 years. And to date, no method or model has uniform acceptance among experts. I would urge policymakers growth models for statewide accountability systems. Too often, growth models have not generated valid and reliable trend data at the state, district, and school level promised by advocates. The introduction of the menu option for Arizona's high school assessment program this year has generated problems for continued use of growth model for the accountability system. I have not had access to many of the technical details underlying these problems, but my handout discusses likely problem areas including converting SAT or ACT scores to a common scale of measurement, to permit valid and reliable aggregation and disaggregation of growth model data. On page 3, I question whether the growth model treatment for high school results is really needed or desirable in this circumstance, suggesting a cohort comparison method may be a better choice. Finally, I want to say I support further evolution of the ESSA authorized menu design for high school state assessment programs. It potentially addresses a shortcoming for mandatory high school statewide tests, that no one-size-fits-all program will ever be satisfactory for high schools that offer multiple instructional pathways for their students. I've got a 2-page legislative policy brief describing how an individual student menu option design may be a better long-range strategic goal for high school assessments, and I left a few copies of that 2-page brief with Catcher and would be happy to answer any questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Jeff Esposito, followed by Dr. Trujillo.
President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members of the Board of Education. On behalf of Arizona's second largest school district, I'm very happy to be here this morning to address all of you. I want to thank Superintendent Hoffman for making the great effort to come out to Pima County more than once so far in her short tenure as state superintendent. We really appreciate and value the opportunities that we've had to welcome you to our district. So I'm here this morning because you've got some big decisions in front of you, and I want to speak very briefly to our perspective on 3 very, very important points. Number 1, as we've heard before with some previous speakers, we are very, very concerned about the state of the high schools and where we're at right now in terms of an ability to measure growth for this academic school year for 18-19. We are one of the districts that has selected the ACT through the menu item of assessments, and we would really, really appreciate and feel that it's in the best interest of our district and our students that for this particular academic school year, for the purpose of providing the board more time to develop a comprehensive academic achievement methodology that would accurately measure growth, that this year probably be considered a hold harmless with regard to the A through F letter grades that would be issued to our high schools. Long range, I would urge the board to consider one standardized assessment, whether that be the ACT or the SAT. I'm not here to promote any particular vendor, for use for high schools throughout the state for the purposes of being able to streamline those comparative analyses that are necessary to measure growth. I will say that inside of Tucson Unified, we've done our own comparative analysis on junior class attendance rates for the ACT versus AZ Merit, and the ACT attendance rates are almost near 100%, which speaks to the relevance that the students attach to the ACT as sort of being the gold standard for university-going acceptance. That's just something you probably want to consider. Secondly, testing season is upon us, and immediately after testing season, large districts, all districts actually move into test preparation for the upcoming academic year. The future of AZ Merit is unknown for the school year 1920, and I would urge this board to consider at least a 1-year extension of AZ Merit. I speak from the perspective of having been in charge of a school district that has moved a quarter of all of its schools. 22 of our 86 measurable schools moved up an entire letter grade on the AZ Merit standardized assessment. And it wasn't happenstance. It was a result of 3 or 4 years of very hard work, aligning our curriculum to the college and career readiness standards, aligning our benchmarks, selecting a benchmark product, implementing professional development. To be able to have to do all of that again in 1 year and then be measured on that would not be in the best interest of the 45,000 students under our charge. I thank you for your consideration of these requests this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jeff Esposito.
Madam Superintendent, Chairman Narducci, members of the board. For the record, my name is Jeff Esposito. I'm here today on behalf of the Arizona School Counselors Association. Going to mix up the topic here a little bit, talk to you about item 5D. We are very grateful for not only you all opening up this process, but for the work of State Board staff, specifically Catcher Baden, in helping work through this so quickly. We're supportive of the changes being proposed as we are working to make sure that the role of school counselors is properly defined and that we are adequately funding the need that we have for our school counselor to student ratio right now. It's critical that we have a certification process that reflects the rigor and qualifications that we'd like to see for these professionals. And so just wanted to say thank you all for that and that we're supportive of this process.
That concludes the call to the public.
Thank you to all the folks who spoke. Appreciate all the comments. Move on to agenda item number 5. And move on to 5A, and this is a study session for the 9 to 12 accountability system, and no action will be taken, but a presentation made. But before we start, like to note that we are going to move item 5K to follow 5A because it makes sense to do that, and we'll go from there. Who's presenting? Okay, thank you.
Give me the mouse. There we go. Oh, because I can just click it right. Okay. Can you push me back? All right, President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members of the board. Today I'll be presenting on item 5A, the study session in regard to the 912 accountability system and the asks of the State Board of Education members from the February 2019 board meeting. Before we begin, I do want the board members, while we're having this discussion on this study session, I want you to think about where you individually feel comfortable having an action item for the accountability system for 912. Whether that date is 2 weeks from now at a special meeting, or that date is at the April State Board of Education regular meeting. But as we go through this, keep that in the back of your mind because board staff will need some direction on that so that we can move to schedule a special meeting or keep it at the regular April meeting. In any of those two scenarios, we do plan as board staff to just put a quick survey out so we can get some feedback based upon what is in this PowerPoint presentation from the field. So with that, we will begin. Maybe. Okay. So if you recall, at the February board meeting, we had 2 State Board of Education members request 2 different look-ats. So one was Member Baker asked the department and the ATAC to look at linking AZ Merit, ACT, and SAT. Member Mack's request was to look at the subgroup growth or gap improvement. So in front of you, you have a lot of materials. So I will be going through the PowerPoint presentation. There is also an additional handout. It's titled with like the contents page. This goes through the different modeling and kind of business rules of the different growth subgroup. The second handout is estimation of AZ Merit cut points on ACT and SAT exams. So that handout looks like. We have a rubric that breaks down all 10 options that have been presented to the board thus far. And the longer document that starts with Approach 1 Current System is the longer version of that Excel spreadsheet. It breaks down each one going into the challenges and whatnot. Okay. So linking AZ Merit to ACT and SAT, this was a joint product for the ATAC and the department. We're looking at establishing a growth measure on a menu environment. Yes?
Does Cal have it?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. They did this themselves because it was an ask for the State Board of Education. It should be noted that test vendors would be contractually required to provide a linking study. Okay. From my understanding, there was. Do you want to talk about the letter from ACT, SAT?
So President Narducci and members, so if you recall, there was some conversation since probably December that this is usually work that the vendors do whenever we have a statewide assessment. Statutorily, the vendors are required to do this linking work for accountability purposes. However, just due to a number of circumstances and timing of when we put the RFP out, and there was some questions legally about if the vendors could continue that work while an active RFP was out, and we were trying to resolve those questions. And that's why in the meantime, when the board had asked, an ATAC member and AD corroborated and started doing this work and presented it here. But we have, in the meantime, also, worked with the department to ensure that the vendors can indeed continue that work even with the active RFP. We just have to make sure we wall off certain things within the department and at the board, not because they would intersect, but just to make sure that for perception's sake that we're not violating anything. So ATAC and ADE did this work, but it comes with a caveat that the vendors will have to utilize and leverage their data and their resources to sort of bring it home.
Okay. So there were 3 researchers who worked on linking AZ Merit to SAT and ACT separately. However, the results were similar. Depending on the subject, there was a 50 to 55% of students performed at the same performance level across assessment types, and it varies based upon the different assessment and the performance levels. The results of this study raise questions for not only growth but also proficiency. It is very similar to the Florida study that was previously shared with the board. So what the researchers did is they took the file from the department that contained students who had taken the AZ Merit test, had taken the ACT test, and or had taken the SAT test, and they looked at those kids. They tried to link, and when they tried to link, 50% of those students were within the same performance band. I felt like I had something else for that. Go back one. Do any of the board members have any questions in regard to the linking of AZ Merit, ACT, and SAT? Additional information on this ask is found in the document titled Estimation of AZ Merit Cut Points on ACT and SAT Exams. And I will admit, the more technical the question, the more I'll have to rely on my friends from the department and the ATAC, because I don't know all the answers. I would point out in the document labeled Estimation of AZ Merit Cut Points on ACT and SAT Exams, on that cover page, there is a table labeled Percentage of Select Groups in the Study. So when you look at the groups that were utilized in this study, you will will see that certain groups aren't very well represented. So one question that could come from this is the modeling going to accurately reflect what happens with this testing administration this spring? And does anyone from the department or the ATAC want to expand on anything, or did I miss anything? Okay. Member Baker, do you have any questions in regard to this?
I'll wait till you're through with the whole report.
Okay, thank you. All right, so subgroup growth and gap improvement. This is labeled as approach 7 in the subgroup packet. Again, that one's labeled with the heading of contents. So there's 3 parts to this subgroup growth and gap improvement. It's subgroup proficiency improvement, which would be worth 10 points, subgroup graduation improvement, which is 5, and subgroup dropout improvement, which is 5. The subgroups include all of those listed there. However, maybe some direction that the board could give to the ATAC and to the department is whether or not the board would also like to include the bottom 25% of students. The modeling that you will see in this PowerPoint presentation, and also the modeling that you see within your additional materials, does not include that bottom 25%. Okay. So this is method C. This is, again, remember, there's subgroup proficiency improvement. That's 10 points out of the 20. So we're going to take each one individually. So this is the first one. Points are awarded for the groups of students. It's based on individual student scores. You divide the number of subgroups and subjects by what the school is eligible for to get an improvement rate. And then that improvement rate is multiplied by 10. So when we look at just this method C, which is that subgroup proficiency improvement, what I want to point out is when you compare it to the current growth, so that's the current system, current growth, 2 things that jump out is you lower the correlation to free and reduced lunch, so it goes from 0.35 to 0.19, and you lower the correlation to proficiency. So current growth is correlated at 0.77. Using this method, it's at 0.35. So here's FRL, and there's proficiency. Subgroup graduation improvement. This would follow the current business rules for a 4-year graduation rate. To be eligible, you have to have at least 10 students in the cohort. FAE is not applied. The same 10 subgroups as stated earlier in the slides would be used, and the difference is between the previous 2-year graduation rates. There also, because it is staying consistent with the business rules, there will also be that 90% for maintaining that 90. You would get credit for maintaining that 90% graduation rate. Consider like a threshold. The final one in those 3 for subgroup and gap performance is subgroup dropout improvement. You would follow the same business rules for dropout rate, which can be found in the department's graduation dropout and persistent rate technical manual. You must have at least 10 students. FAE is not applied. Same 10 subgroups as proficiency and grad rate would be used. The difference is between the current year and prior year dropout rate. A school does not receive credit for maintaining a subgroup's dropout rate if it stays 100%. So when you look at the numbers behind subgroup growth and gap improvement, if you're asking yourself, well, what does this look like to the current system, to the current model, that can be found on the document, again, that's labeled as contents. And that is on page 15, where you can pull up the current model. When you look at the percentage, so when you look at all the different letter grades and you look at this percentage here, it relatively stays the same. You don't see really big movements. However, what you see here is the correlation to when you use subgroup and you're looking at the correlations, this is a change, this negative 0.02. So you're actually decreasing the correlation to school size. Now, I'd be amiss if I didn't also state this. You do see a drop in the median score. These are the conclusions. They looked at all available ACT and SAT data. Results were similar to the Florida study. The ATAC and the department considered 10 different approaches to growth, and all 10 of those are summarized in that document I described earlier as labeled as contents. Believe subgroup growth gap improvement or approach 7 is viable at this time for the 2018-2019 school year. And this approach comes with the same concerns that exist with proficiency. With that, I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Director Williams. Let's go with questions, and we'll start on my right.
President Narducci, members of the board, and Alicia, it says this approach comes with the same concerns that exist with proficiency. Are there other concerns that you see or that the department sees?
President Narducci and Member Burton, what do you mean? Are there other concerns with this approach?
Are there any weaknesses with this approach?
Let me pull that up.
President Narducci, Member Burton, I'm trying to remember the ATAC meetings. I think that there was discussion about how exactly to calculate, the proficiency, the subgroup proficiency gap improvement, and there was some discussion. Some of those were very in the weeds, frankly, and very business rule oriented about how to ensure that schools are going to hold all of their subgroups accountable, and would they get points for just improving a couple, or we want to make sure that a wide variety, that they have to make sure they're moving a lot of their subgroups up. That was a pretty in-the-weeds discussion, and there were some concerns about that, but I feel like that was something that ATAC and ADE were able to work through and not a concern with the larger approach. But that's the first thing that comes to mind, but I certainly don't want to dissuade members of ATAC or ADE if there's other concerns that they brought up. Alicia just pointed out to me that in that large all growth approaches summary document that had been provided that has all 10 approaches, there are the challenges listed with each. If I recall, I think some of the challenges that were with approach 7, similar to that last bullet point, were pretty specific to, linking the multiple assessments is going to be hard. So there's just challenges inherent with that. But that was on page 7 of that document with some of the challenges with that approach.
Thank you.
Thank you. Member Kay.
President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members of the board, it seems that all of this hinges on the testing vendors linking. So that's a big unknown right now. Do we have a timeline? I realize it's been sensitive in terms of procurement and some of those challenges. Do we have a timeline as to when they will be able to provide that information?
President Narducci and Member Kay, we actually asked that question when we provided the the legal safe haven for that work to continue. We haven't had a definitive answer yet. I will say that when we first had discussed the timeline, I think in the fall and end of last year, before the RFP was out about when this would happen, I think it was at least several weeks in order to get that work done. But I will say that, and commend, and maybe not put pressure on the vendors, but I'll commend the ATAC member and ADE who put together this study, frankly, within the span of, I think, like 2 weeks. And the ATAC member, volunteered his time to make that happen. And then ADE, of course, had other things that they had took out of their time to corroborate it. So I think that would be a reasonable ask to try to match that, but we don't have a definitive timeline yet.
Can I ask a question off your question? Why did the vendors take so long? I mean, I don't understand. When you're private sector, you should be able to respond to requests to produce things in a short period of time.
President Narducci, members of the board, our understanding is that the vendors, when they talked to their legal team, the legal team suggested to the vendors that because we were in open procurement that they should not engage with people like us because we're in procurement. So
got it.
I wish I would have said that more eloquently, but
no, you're right. Yeah, got it. Go ahead. We keep on going.
President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members, it seems though we have a path forward at this time, or are we saying we have to make a decision and then the information will be provided? Because, well, I agree. I mean, this is an incredible amount of work and really appreciate all of the work that went into it. The documents clearly state that it all hinges on the testing vendors providing this information. So we may be making decisions that look very different once we have the information from the testing vendors. I mean, I think these are probably our very best assessment of where we might end up, but we really don't know right now. And the way I read this, it seems that proficiency is an issue. So solving that, I think we need to solve that issue before we can even get to the growth issue, because otherwise we're making decisions about growth that are built on a platform that we already have concerns about.
President Narducci and Member Kay and members, I just want to jump in and I don't want to take us back to a point that it seemed like we moved on from. But one thing back to the vendor question and doing the linking is that they were going to bring in Arizona educators to help do some of that work, and there was going to be some time and cost with bringing those folks in. So that would be one explanation as to why. And the work that ATAC and ADE did, they did not do that. So that would be one reason why it might take a little bit longer. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't shortchanging them, because they did talk about that to us. I just had forgotten that, but I'm sorry to rehash that.
Thank you, Catcher. Thank you, Member Kay. Member Wellborn.
President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, and members of the board. I have a clarification question to make sure I have an accurate understanding. The linking study that we've asked of the vendors, is that the same kind of work that's been done by the ATAC, or is it more providing a roadmap on how to transfer results from an SAT or an ACT test and compare it to AZ Merit? And the reason I asked for that question is there any reason to believe that their linking study would be any different than the one we're looking at right now?
President Narducci, Member Wellborn, I think I would probably defer to some of the folks who maybe did that work to be able to speak to the technical side of it a little bit more than I can. And I looked at Mr. Kelly Powell, and he was so kind to actually come up when I asked. So,
thanks, Catcher. Thank you, Member Wellborn and members of the board. So I produced one of the studies, and two other research scientists at the department independently produced theirs. I started off with just a simple kind of equipercentile method, because that was a quick way of doing it, and I had to come to the department to produce it, and that's what I could get done in 2 or 3 hours. And that was the amount of time it took. Of course, I did it wrong the first time and I came back, but another 2 or 3 hours, and I'm pretty confident with the results. The research scientist at ADE started with doing kind of a predicted score, basically translating, using a regression model, the ACT scores into an AZ Merit metric, which I also did predicted scores. All of the results looked very similar. And I'm not sure if that answers your question, but these are the standard kind of methods that you would have. You can do some more nonlinear methods that would include other variables for the prediction of, say, translating an ACT score into an AZ Merit score. But a lot of policy boards like to go with a straight kind of linear regression model, or not adding in other variables such as student demographics, because it becomes a little bit more questionable.
So you would expect that the vendor-generated linking studies would replicate or be similar to the results we found from your studies?
If they use the same data, I would predict that they would be very similar.
Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you, Member Welborn. Anybody else to my right? To my left? On to Member K. Mac.
President Artucci, President Hoffman, members of the board. I just want to start off by thanking ATAC and ADE for all this incredible amount of work and information we have available to us. I may have missed this. I'm just curious as to method A versus method C on page 6, because it appears like there's a lower correlation there than method A seems to be lower correlation than method C. I'm just wondering why method C was highlighted. Am I missing? Yeah.
President Narducci and Member Mack, I think we would probably defer to the department to answer that one as best.
Member Mack, members of the board. So, the issue with that is because of the amount of points assigned for subgroups, you really only need to have 3 of your subgroups grow in order to get full points. So there's very little differentiation. So kind of everybody gets a 10, not quite everybody, but a large group does. So naturally, then the correlation to free and reduced lunch would lower, since kind of everybody's achieving that goal.
Thank you. Yeah. And then my other question is, if it's possible, I wouldn't mind looking at the bottom 25% unless there is a reason we shouldn't move ahead with that. Looking at the board members.
Say that.
As a subgroup, because it wasn't looked at in this time around, but I would be open to seeing what that produces as well.
Can I ask a question on that? And I'm not disagreeing. Was the bottom 25% left out for a reason, or what did we decide that earlier and I just blanked it out?
I got this.
Okay.
Sure, yeah. President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members, we did do a subgroup bottom 25 analysis. It was done separately. The reason we just moved it into the other one, but we have the data analysis. The reason we didn't highlight it is because when you're doing the bottom 25, you're only including 25% of your population.
Okay.
And President Narducci, Member Mack, I'll also just note that those subgroups that were selected were the standard subgroups that we use as part of ESSA, and that's why ADE had pulled those and not automatically included bottom 25 off the bat.
Anything else, Member K?
Just the others. Mac.
I know, that's why I said it on purpose. 3-letter names, I just can't. I'll get them right. Member Baker.
Yes, President Narducci, members of the board, and Director Williams, can you talk a little bit more about how the subgroup system works? In other words, how is more specifically, how is a subgroup included, and what happens with schools that have lots of subgroups, and what happens with schools that have just a few subgroups? Let's just start with that.
President Narducci, Member Baker, can one of my friends help me out?
Friend.
Member Baker, Allen from the department is speaking.
Member Baker, members of the board. So to kind of answer your question, the approach that we were talking about, I guess method, makes it to where schools are held of 100% of their students in subgroups if they meet that minimum N count. And so you're correct that if a school has you have a really diverse and large school that meets 10 different subgroups across 2 different assessments, so all 20 groups, that is perhaps maybe a higher bar than maybe a smaller school that has 2 subgroups at it. But you're still being held accountable for all 100% of your students. And the interesting thing in talking with people from small schools and large schools is in different settings, they had different problems with it. Small schools said, it'll be harder for us to do this. We don't have the resources that larger schools did. Larger schools that I spoke with said that, well, it's easier for a smaller school to move than it is a larger school. And so depending on the perspective, it seemed like either large schools or small schools, and of course small n size of a few that I've talked to, had different issues with it. But in either case, you're still being held 100% of your student body as long as they meet that FAE N count, with arguments on either side of which one it's more difficult, larger, more diverse schools or smaller, less diverse schools. Is there a specific question that I didn't address in that I could, Member Baker?
Yes. So just help me to understand. So if a student is in a subgroup that does not meet the N count, then that student is not factored in. Is that correct?
For that subgroup. Now, because of the cross-cutting nature of the subgroups, a student may not qualify for one subgroup but another. We have ethnic demographics, racial demographics, socioeconomic demographics, language demographics, and also there's others. The nice thing about approach or method C is that we could add other things to there based off of needs, so adding perhaps homeless students of military families. I'm trying to think of other ones that we collect. So you're correct that a student may not, say, be in subgroup A, whatever that one is, but they might belong to another subgroup, which would bring their scores in because of like I said, the cross-cutting nature across socioeconomic, racial, ethnic, and like I said, possible other statuses that we could bring in.
Okay, so in other words, a student gets counted more times if they're in more groups?
Yes. I mean, if you're in more than one subgroup, yes, you would be captured by the different subgroups.
Let me hold for just a second. Let somebody else ask a question.
Member Welborn.
I have another question about the FAE. So it's possible with FAE of 10, you can have, in a small school situation, you could have 1 year where you have enough people in a category such as multiple races. You could have 10 students and you would have a valid metric. Mm-hmm. And the next year, because it's a small school, you have 8 people in the multiple races. So that whole subgroup is nullified in terms of growth.
Right.
Okay. Do we have any idea what the consistency is having these FAE appearances groups? I mean, is there going to be so much volatility based on the FAE being 10 with small schools that it's, for a lot of these categories, it's going to be hard to get year-to-year data where 1 or 2 students are going to impact the outcome of this measure?
Is there a way to look at that? Is that your question, Member Welborn?
I think it's a question.
Sure. That's something we can absolutely do a study on, look at of
confused.
consistency of how many are included from year to year. Is that the question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if we have any kind of history to know how often one year they're going to have a FAE group and next year they won't.
That's something absolutely that we can look at for you and try to get that to you quickly from the data set that we've.
Well, I guess the information would be how consistent is this as a metric from year to year? We've got a large number of subgroups. Mm-hmm. There is some merit to look at more consistent subgroups so that you can know over time this is not going to appear and disappear and impact outcomes that way.
Absolutely. That's something the department can look at for you, Member Welborn.
This is Member Baker again. So just to clarify, depending on which subgroups a student is a part of will determine how many times that student's score is counted in the calculations.
Yes, Member Baker.
Okay. And then secondly, is the calculation of the subgroup growth based on how one student does from one year to the next, or is it based on how all the students in the subgroup this year compare to all the students in the subgroup the previous year?
Member Baker, to be included, a student would have to have a score from the current year and the previous year to show growth. And then if they are proficient from one year to the next, then they would be included either way. But if they grow from one year to the next not being proficient in the prior year to being proficient in the current year, they would be included. So it's kind of an individual brought-up level approach.
So, Member Baker, just to clarify, it's individual based.
It is individual based. If is trying to understand this, if the student is in the same subgroup at the same school 2 years in a row, and if that student's arrival or departure does not affect the end count.
Could you repeat that, Cal? Thanks.
So I'm just trying to wrap my head around all the different factors involved. So a student has to be in a particular subgroup for 2 consecutive years in order to be counted. And that, and again, I'm thinking of small schools here, that subgroup has to maintain its end count during those 2 years. In other words, if the end count is 10 and there were 11 students in the subgroup last year, but this year there's only 9 students, then the growth of those 9 students don't get calculated because the end count no longer has been met.
Yes, Member Baker, consistent with other practices involving FAE, if a school does not have that end count, then the student would be pulled out. But again, that's being consistent with other policies involving FAE students.
But I think his point is that it has to be the same 10 students, right, not just an end count. In order, if we're doing individual growth measurements, you're saying the same 10 students have to have a first-year score, and then they have to have a second-year score in order to calculate growth. Is that correct?
Go ahead.
President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members, I'm going to sort of take it down just a little bit, put it a little bit more simply. So we have your kids that are FAE this year. Okay, they've been there all year. They have a valid test record. Regardless of what subgroup is, those are your kids that we're looking at. What we look at there, those are FAE kids. We don't care where, but we pull in their previous year scores. So those are your kids. From that pile there, your current FAE kids with a current academic score who have a previous year score regardless where it came from, those are your pod of kids. Then from there, they're divided into the various subgroups that they would fall into. Does that help?
Yep.
Okay. That was my next answer, sorry.
So Cal, does that answer your question? Or are you asking as well as if kid Mike is in 1 year, but he doesn't fall within it the next year, is he counted?
President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members, if a child were to leave a program, for example, in the previous year they may have been EL, but then they they became proficient, they're no longer EL. Maybe they weren't in special ed the previous year, but now qualify for that program. Whatever their current status is for the current fiscal year will be the program and or determination what subgroups you fall into.
So in a small, thank you. So in a small school that they may have somebody drop from one subgroup to another, what happens to that kid and the subgroup now falls under 10 because kid Mike drops out of the subgroup, so then they won't be counted, that subgroup is not going to be counted in that small district anymore?
President Arnucci, that would be correct. If that subgroup were to fall under the count of 10, then that subgroup would not count. It's the same kind of reporting we do for public reporting, 10 or less. Again, if they fall underneath that number, they wouldn't be reported. However, that student would probably fall into one of the ethnicities and be counted somewhere else, just not with, in this case, let's say, resource.
Okay, thank you.
And President Narducci, Wendy, we're utilizing the same subgroup business rules as what we use for K-8 acceleration subgroup, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Member K.
President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, I assume that you ran the subgroups on every school involved. So what was the minimum number of subgroups that an individual school had, and what was the maximum?
Member K, this is off of memory, and so I want to say the minimum was 2 and the maximum was 19. Again, this is from memory, with the average being 5 eligible groups, I think. Again, off of memory, I can get the exact numbers for you, but I think that those, or at least the 2 and the 19, I'm fairly confident on. The 5, I think, might be like 5.3 or something technically, since it's an average in the state.
Thank you.
Member Mack.
President Arducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members of the board. So I guess my question is, I understand the FAE, the way we're looking at it, is consistent with other models, but I'm wondering now, with looking at the subgroup, does it in fact capture a higher degree of accuracy, or does it capture more of the students that we want to capture overall? Because if they're not captured by one group, they're captured by another. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Whereas if it was just if we're just looking at FAE, we might be missing some. I don't know.
Oh, so
yeah.
Member Mack, to make sure I'm understanding your question, maybe taking the FAE off of the subgroup portion. Is that what you're suggesting?
No, I'm just wondering or hoping that we are capturing more of the kids if we're looking at the subgroup.
Absolutely. As long as the school has that 10 subgroup, the 10 FAE count, in the subgroup, that subgroup would be included, but students will be in multiples. And so, like I said, we're cross-cutting here and giving more opportunities for the student to be held accountable in the system. Absolutely.
And President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members of the board, that was why the method C was used over the method A, was that it was more inclusive of all of the subgroups.
Thank you, Jessica.
Very good. Okay.
Narducci, I think it's already been, sorry.
Cal, we have Member K and then you.
Thank you. I think it's already been stated, but on the flip side, a student could also, they could harm or help a school on either side, right, more than once. Mm-hmm. So if they fell into multiple categories, smaller schools or even larger schools, has that been looked at? How many times individual students might be counted and the impact that would have had on a school? Probably not enough time.
Member K, it has not. We'd be have to go to the kind of student level aspect of that data, which is possible, and then looking at the counts of the students. So it's just a matter of work and the time that may take, but that is, again, possible to look at, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Cal?
President Narducci, members of the board, on the document that's in our packet compiled by Kelly Powell, on the third page, it's labeled Estimation of AZ Merit Cut Points on ACT and SAT exams. On the third page, in the middle of the page, he makes this statement: the question for policymakers is, how good should we expect? And second, what degree of precision do we need? And I'd suggest that those are both excellent questions, but they are not the most significant questions. And I'll just go back to what I have said before, that at the end of the day, this is not just a math problem. This is a very, very significant incentive problem. And so the fundamental questions that we should be addressing is what is going to incentivize improvement of education in Arizona? What's going to cause educators and school systems to change their behavior to improve education for students? And I would suggest that one of the sub-questions to that issue is it understandable? Because of an incentive program is not understandable, its value is questionable. And that the groups that really need to understand this is the parents, the teachers, the site administrators, the site attendance clerks, and as is evident by our discussion in the last 15, 20 minutes on all the subgroups, I don't think it meets that test. I think the simplicity of being able to state every student has been placed at a level based on the test that they took. They take another test the following year, and if they improve that level, then the school benefits from that, and the grade of the school goes forward. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, and this was talked about at the last meeting extensively, this should not be a system that is based on how well can you recruit students. And what we really want is for when that low-performing student shows up at the registrar's desk, that the school secretary, the principal, the teachers all understand, yep, we should take this kid, because if we can move this kid up a level, we are going to benefit by that. And the conglomeration of calculations on all the subgroups is going to lose the simplicity of that point.
Thank you, Cal. Armando.
President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members of the board. Been thinking about this for some time, and if you'll bear with me, I remember when school choice entered into the public domain, to the whole public discussion. And I think the most powerful result out of that was that every parent now was empowered like never before. And that is, I as a parent could decide where to send my kid, and in that empowerment, it also, there was an incentive to schools to listen to parents. You knew that if your money was based upon a parent's satisfaction, then that parent, each and every parent that came to that front desk was super important and is super important during the year. And not only this year, but next year, and hopefully in all the years that they attend your school. So the question is, what for policymakers, what's the key question? I think it's something similar. And that is, how do you empower or make valuable each and every child? What we don't want to do is create a category of undesirables, where that person at the front desk all the principal, but the most important person is that person at the front desk, and it's because the school leader is going to say, man, if you see this kind of kid who come in the door, you let me know. Why? Because we may not get the credit. This is going to be really hard to educate this child. And that I believe there's nobody who wants to see that. So the key question is, how do you provide this value to every child that comes in the door? It doesn't matter if you're poor. It doesn't matter if you speak Spanish or you don't speak English. It doesn't matter if you're special ed. That's the category that's going to be the challenge. I don't care what. That's all the kids who are really smart, really proficient. Man, they come in the door, you go, we'll find you a spot. We don't care. We'll find you a spot. It's the other categories. And I think that's the key question. That's the question for us as policymakers. How do we put value and power to every child who's going to come in that door? So if I'm a practitioner, I'm the school leader, I'm the person at the front desk, I go, this kid's important, and this family's important. Because I know at the end of the day, I know there's incentives, and I know there's the carrot and the stick. I know there's potential money and potential repercussions if the school doesn't perform. But every child that comes in, that's our task. How do we find a measurement system that provides value to every child that comes in that door so that schools will know every child is important and there's an incentive for me to educate that child and accept them into our school? And that's hard. I'm not going to say it's easy.
Thank you, Armando. Very good comments. Other comments?
President Narducci, I believe some members of the ATAC would like to address the board.
Okay. I have a question, though, because I agree with everything that's been said. And school choice is a great thing, and I'm all supportive of it. But in a rural community, when you don't have the choice, and you're one of the reasons why we didn't move to a certain location, even though my mom lives up there, was because of the schools. And how does this work into that when you have to have everybody who's in your community going to your school? It seems like you're going to have all the subgroups, and you don't have, because we know that even though we don't want that to happen, we know that that's occurring. We know that some schools are accepting whomever they want to have in their schools. And that's a concern. And I don't know how to get over it, and I don't know the answer to that. But in the rural communities where you're taking who has to come in the door, which is a good thing, you want to make sure that those guys are incentivized too and have that carrot and not just be stuck because of the approach that we adopt here and policy reason-wise. That's my only comment. I don't have any solutions. Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
That's okay, President Narducci. Thank you very much. Superintendent Hoffman, members of the board. As I listened to this discussion, and as I've listened to the conversations that took place in the ATAC, and even before that, back in October of 2016, the executive director of the Arizona Rural Schools Association asked me as a superintendent from a small unified school district to attend the ad hoc meetings. And so I attended all the ad hoc meetings. And then I started attending the TAC meetings when we had the group of technical experts, and then that went away. And then the ATAC was put together, and I was asked to serve on that. And so as I've watched this evolve over the last couple of years, the conversation about incentivization is something that we need to be very careful with, because to me, I understand the need for schools to see benefits to creating certain types of programs, but I also see the need to not characterize the efforts of teachers as being driven overly by accountability. I think that when a teacher gets 30 kids in their classroom, their goal is to educate those 30 kids to the best of their ability. And so we need to recognize that effort and not treat it like the decisions that are made here about which growth measure we work are going to somehow get a teacher turned on or turned off about educating a kid. I think our teachers are doing a great job. We've moved from a good, better, best discussion to a bad, worse, worst discussion when it comes to how we're going to do this. I think that you've received recommendations from the ATAC that have looked at all of the options and basically said, you know what, to use the words of Mr. Garrett, this is the least worst option that we can have. Are there problems with it? Absolutely, 100%. Do we know what the problems are? Yes. They're all in front of you. The information is provided in the packet. As a small school superintendent, I hate moving to subgroup performance where we're looking at cohort this year versus cohort next year, because the number of kids in a different grade level that have different amounts of special needs, different amounts of free and reduced lunches, they vary. And I've got 1,000 kids. There are tons of districts in the state that are smaller
Everyone
than that.
else
that
has left the call.
Those kinds of things. Okay. So
not us. Okay, we're still here.
I guess that's saying to sit down. But I think as when we look at small schools, when we look at rural schools, the question of are we giving them a fair shake when we use a system that looks at this year's performance versus next year's performance? If a value is missing, that's a 0. If you get a value next year, you've automatically improved. Even if you go from 0 to 40%, conversely, you go from 40% to 0, you've decreased. You go from 95% to 0 because you lost that end count, you've decreased your score. There's all kinds of problems with this method. That said, it's the least worst option on the table. And I think that needs to be taken into consideration, along with the fact that we need to move past fiscal year 19 and allow the experts to start working on fiscal year 20 if we're going to hope to have a good system for how we ever grade schools. We could keep doing this forensic accountability thing year after year after year. It's kind of become our modus operandi in Arizona, and we should try to work to change that. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you. I hate to go with the least worst option, but you got to start somewhere, huh?
Sometimes.
It's like medical treatment. You got to get it going, and hopefully something better comes along the way. Superintendent Hoffman.
President Narducci and members of the board, it is really hard to say what is the least worst option. I think none of us are comfortable with that, which is why we keep asking questions and thinking really critically about the choices in front of us. And I really appreciate all the data and research, that, especially from the ATAC group, to really dig deep into this and try to find what is the best option, even if that is the least worst option. And so I want to kind of go back to the public comments of, if we're looking at what is the least worst option, then maybe we should be talking about holding harmless for a year, because we are just looking at this school year, and this is a very messy year because our schools are administering the SAT, the ACT, and the AZ Merit, and I'm not comfortable with a plan that is going to create greater inequities and result in not having fairness across our districts, across the whole state. And so with the model where it's where we're looking at sorry, I don't get all the numbers mixed up, but the one where this study, when we're looking at the cut points of ACT and SAT exams, and we're saying that there's only a roughly around 50 to 55% of comparability, then to me that says that some districts would be receiving higher grades than other districts based on which tests they gave, and there would be a lot of inequities and unfairness across districts. And as I've traveled the state talking with superintendents, I mean, we're looking at what is the least worst option, and I think we should at least be considering holding harmless for this year, because it is just a transition year. It is just this year that is very messy as we're transitioning and figuring out what comes next as we transition a menu, and we do need to work together to create a more stable plan for the future. But in the meantime, for this year, what can we do to stabilize the field? That's a comment.
Thank you, Superintendent. Any other comments before I asked Alicia what our next steps are? None. Alicia. Oh, Member Wilburn.
Yeah, President Narducci, I think Alicia asked us at the beginning to try and articulate what her next steps were in the sense of what other data or information can be helpful to resolve this issue. And I have similar thoughts compared to what the superintendent says. The lack of comparability between ACT, SAT, and AZ Merit is a game stopper. It really is. So anything doesn't even matter what the growth issues are. We can't even get proficiency right. So I don't know I think we need to articulate what are the options. Is it hold a moratorium? Is it try and persuade, try and create a situation? What are we working towards to a system where we just go back to one assessment for all the schools? I mean, we need a little vision here about how to get out of the rabbit hole, given what we've learned so far, so that we can make a decision and start working towards a resolution that isn't forensic, accountability, that is fair, that is simple, and will work, given what we know. I'm not hearing any more avenues of research that can change our situation and our understanding of our challenge. I'm hearing that the vendor linking studies are likely to produce the same information. And so I think we have to grapple with what we know now, what's the best way forward. And I'm actually uncomfortable with the concept of going forward with the least worst option. That doesn't sound like excellent practice to me. It's the least worst option because we've made this thing so complex. There's so many variables in it that we're trying to satisfy so many different particular interests that we've created this rabbit hole. So I encourage my colleagues to try and go back to what is the basis of accountability, what are we trying to incent in our schools, and possibly at least reach a consensus among ourselves of what's the right way to provide our role in accountability, but also recognize what the legislature has required in terms of menu assessment.
Okay, thank you. So I just have sometimes not doing anything is doing something, and sometimes that's the best. I've seen systems run, and this is just a comment again, for consideration. I don't want to be in the same place a year from now or next January just because we're churning things and not coming to a result, and we're faced with the least worst option again next year. Because I could see what you said is 100% accurate. I mean, you've got the vendors who have provided information, and they'll provide further information, and every consultant can provide information until you die, and then even afterwards. ATAX has already told us that it's going to be. They've studied it linear. They've studied the linear method. And, it's not coming out, so I better just stick with shorter words. And that they don't think it's going to be any different. So my question is: so if we stay status quo, and we do the hold harmless year, what do we expect to be different?
So, President Narducci, members of the board, I need clarification on what you mean by hold harmless.
Oh, okay. Superintendent.
President Narducci and members of the board, by hold harmless, I mean that whatever grade was received in the last school year, so fiscal year 18, the schools would hold on to the same grade for this year, fiscal year 19. So it's keeping the same grade steady because we can't find a statistically viable way that the board can come to an agreement on picking the least of the worst options. So the idea is to hold steady for this because this is the transition year, and it does give us time to figure out a plan and also work with the legislature, which is something we've been doing very actively. Our policy team, as well as the board's policy team, has been working very actively with the legislature on even making changes to menu. Even today, there's going to be, I know Ketcher's going to talk shortly about a bill that is being introduced that talks specifically to the future of menu. So there's just so many moving pieces, especially with the with the legislature. Sorry, Member Mack. So there's so many moving pieces right now that's what I mean by holding harmless.
Okay, thanks. And can I just ask a question, Dr. Chang? If we were to do, and I'm not favoring any positions here at all, just question, how financially, what does that do? Is there money associated with this hold harmless thing and funding?
President Narducci, members of the board, I want to try to be as factual as possible and lay out everything that's in front of the board currently. You have 10 different options that have been modeled for you by the department and the ATAC in regard to the menu of assessments. I've been on record numerous times in front of this board telling the board that statutorily you do not have the authority to hold harmless or not give letter grades but I'm not a lawyer. This is the lawyer. Her name is Kim Anderson. So as the executive director, it makes me nervous when we say hold harmless because my job is to protect the board. Because the State Board of Education has received from the department and ATAC these 10 options, and we continue year after year to do this. I forget how Sean put it. Basically, at the end of the school year, we're making the system, and we do want to get ahead of that. I mean, that has always been the plan. As superintendent knows, because we've been working with her staff in discussions about the menu and what that looks like for the next 5 years, and trying to find a permanent solution to this growth issue, which I do believe we can, starting in the 1920 school year. So we are ultimately, factually, in this weird gap year, in this just weird year of trying to figure out what 18-19 is going to look like for 9-12. Factually as well, President Narducci, you do have the proposed $98 million results-based funding dollars attached to accountability in school letter grades for this current school year, which puts pressure on this board to ensure that the accountability system is as equitable as possible. Also, school accountability is tied to school improvement at the district level. Also, school improvement is tied to charter schools and their ability to stay open, operate, expand. I'm not an expert in the charter school board policies, but that's the gist of it. Etcher, save me.
President Narducci and members, just to Alicia's point, we are charged at the board with having both a menu of assessments and ADAF accountability. And we are going to have to accept, as long as we have assessment choice and as long as we have more than one assessment being taken, that inherently is introducing margins of error and some of that volatility with the 50% that we saw before. So I think we've always talked about moving forward for future years, starting to work on future systems. From what I understand, from what we understand at the staff level, the volatility and variability that we're looking at today could get better when we have additional data and should get better. It could and should get better when the vendors assist and aid. But I think that we need, on staff, I think we need to be very blunt that we are going to have to come to terms in an assessment choice environment that there is going to be some margins of error that we have to be comfortable with. And we can always try to improve, and I think we want to, but we are tasked with doing both of those right now, and we have to come to terms with there are costs and benefits to it, and we're tasked with that right now. So in addition to what Alicia said, I wanted to sort of put that into context that we think we can come up with ATAC and ADE staff a system in 1920 that we feel can be much improved, but I don't think we want to give the impression that the additional 8 months of work is suddenly going to make this the the perfect system. And I guess I also want to, I think we also, some broader context, we always get wrapped around on what we're talking about here at the state, and I think it always feels like we haven't figured it out and what's wrong with us. Every other state who has one statewide assessment, they're struggling with their accountability systems too, and they're changing their accountability systems, they're changing their assessments. It adds an added layer of complexity when we have assessment choice, but all other states are grappling with how to hold schools accountable. So trying to alleviate some of that stress and pressure on us that makes it seem like we haven't found the magic bullet. I don't know if really any system has.
Thank you, Getcher. Dr. Chang.
President Narducci, Superintendent, and members of the board, my initial reaction to a hold harmless was that might be embraced by the A schools, and certainly the F schools would not have the ability to have shown any progress. I have been reflecting on the conversation and the presentations today that we're looking for perfect, and as the old saying is, perfect is the enemy of the good. Reflecting back on years in this board, that several years ago we felt this pressure to do something and get it done, however imperfect it was, and we've been working to improve since then. So staying with the current system allows an F school to go through the process this year and possibly show improvement. It allows for our A schools and our B schools to also have the reflection of their ability to retain their excellence, or if there is some slippage, we would see that based on the current system. That doesn't hold anyone harmless, but it does measure the 2 years in a row using the same or similar criterion. So I really think that we need to keep working at this and come to something that we're more inclined to say meets the criteria of a fair and simple and workable, and not feel like we need to pick one of these 10 very soon with the information we have about the imperfections and the unintended consequences. So thank you for clarifying that we actually don't have the authority to do that anyway, but I wanted to express that I think that we are in many ways not pressured to add or change right now, because we do have a system, however imperfect, has been measured, and schools have letter grades based on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chang. Anybody else?
Question.
Member Royce.
President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members of the board, and staff, in that the present system that we have, or what was being proposed, is 30% on proficiency, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a set number? Is that a hard number that it has to be 30%?
So, President Narducci, Member Ruiz, I believe you're speaking of the indicator weights within the 912 accountability system, and proficiency is set at 30, correct? That was a board decision back in 2016. So yes, the board could change the weights of the indicators. However, this has been a while. This is back in my deputy director days. There's some guidelines, I think, still in ESSA that say that the proficiency needs to be weighted more than the other indicators, both aggregated and disaggregated. Right, Wendy? That's back in the day. So the board could change the weights of the indicator. I would recommend, and I would probably just put it out, not recommend, but just put it out there so everyone's on the same understanding. To change the weights of the indicators this late in the game would make the field probably very nervous and potentially upset. because they at least, the indicator weights has never been something that the board has discussed at length in the past 2 years.
Okay. Let me just kind of follow up. As just looking at the history, in one of these packets, somebody talked about the history of the accountability. And in that, it's kind of, when it first started, it was very high, just based upon proficiency. And then you had the other constituency groups who began to say, hey, wait a minute, that's not fair. And so then after that, you had proficiency, you had growth, and then you had the bottom 25% measured, because every kid was important. And it's kind of gone back and forth, and as you try to perfect it. This is hard. You're never going to perfect this. You're right, President Chang. You're right. You're never going to find perfection in this. It's just we're going to try to get it as best as we can every year or every cycle that you have to. And if the option of hold harmless is not on the table, then we have to act. And this is not going to be perfect. Whatever we come up with is not going to be perfect. But not to have some sort of component of growth in it, that's really difficult to support. Where we don't have any growth component, it will not be perfect. I understand that, but you get through the gap year. Sometimes you just hold your nose and you vote and say, this is the best we can do with what we have in this transitional year. We have to have something that deals with growth.
Thank you. Member Mack.
President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members of the board, so I understand we're in a position where we do have to arrive at some conclusion. And I think sticking to the indicators that we have in place is really important, including growth. I think the question, just scaling back, is now how are we going to measure that growth? And we've been given 10 approaches, and one that's viable right now. And looking at really reflecting back on many of our conversations over the past few years as well, is we were very concerned about not missing any kid, any student. We wanted to make sure every student was counted. Now we're kind of looking, now we've got this cross-cutting model where we are capturing every student, and that sends a message that, hey, every kid is important and we do want to see growth from every child, right? And then the other piece that we've also struggled with quite a bit is I just lost my train of thought, but really capturing that every student. And then, again, if I think of it, I'll come back to it. But that was really, but really, I think we want to maintain definitely the growth. But now we're given this opportunity to really look at how are we going to look at that. Oh, the other thing was we've been struggling with the piece, and going back to our values. Our initial guiding values was really that reduce that correlation to free and reduced lunch or as much as possible. And I think we've been given some numbers that show progress in that area, which is promising. So,
thank you. We've been going for an hour and 45 minutes. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll regroup.
On this item, I'm sorry, President Narducci.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we're gonna, yes. On this item.
On this item.
I'm just so.
Member back here. Okay, it's 11 o'clock. Go back. Had a lot of discussion before. We have a couple of members who want to make comments. We'll take those comments, and then I'm going to ask that we table the discussion and have a special meeting scheduled for 2 weeks. Member Welborn.
I just, for the record, wanted to frame our conversation around what are the challenges that we're trying to fix that cope with this first year, which is a transition year, when a school moves from AZ Merit to an alternate assessment, versus the ongoing years, which is I call the vision. And it seems to me that in a vision year, which could be as long as 3 years down the road, a school that's using SAT as their menu of assessment can have a baseline. Because growth is based on having a baseline. So I understand there's an early version of the SAT, the PSAT. You can require that every school that is doing the SAT also does a PSAT, and I also understand for ACT there's the Aspire. So the challenge is not that the school picks a new menu of assessment. The way we've handled menu of assessment so far is just to say that you're picking one, that menu of assessment, but really they need to have two. They need to have something else that gives us that baseline from which we can measure growth. So it seems to me that transitioning from AZ Merit to another assessment system is a 2 or 3 year process where you've got to establish your baseline year so that by the time you're fully moved over to an ACT or an SAT or something else, you have that baseline data so that growth can be calculated. So I'm concerned about looking at all these 10 different ways of measuring growth. We don't need to do that. What the issue is we don't have baseline data. So if we go back and look at, well, how do we create or require baseline data for every school that gets into a menu, then our problem is solved. And I would rather not change the framework, just change how we collect data from the schools. So if we go forward and have a special study session, I want to reframe what is the challenge that we're trying to cope with. And to me, the challenge we're trying to cope with is how schools transition into a new assessment. Before learning everything we've learned, we thought it could be done in 1 year. And now we've clearly established that that's not consistent with the way we want to measure growth. So can we go back and say, well, really, to transition, you can't just do it in 1 year. You have to do it in a multiple year process. So I just wanted to lay that down there because I really think it's important that we understand the vision of where we're going on this, and I'm concerned about introducing all different various complex methods for calculating growth when we don't need to do that. We can stick with what we have and just find a different way to deal with schools in that transition period. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Welborn. Member Kay.
President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members, I appreciate your comments, Member Welborn. I had concerns also about what the future looks like when a school transitions from AZ Merit to an item off the menu. So I hope that comes back in a future study session. Additionally, I have real concerns with the concept of selecting the best of the worst. The best of the worst is not where I think we want to be in this state, and I don't think it's in the best interest of schools. So whatever we come back with, the best of the worst is just not okay. This subgroup concept is intriguing to me. But again, we have that very basic issue with proficiency. And although we may not have the authority to do a hold harmless, I don't know that we've explored those options. It came up today can we continue to have conversations? Can we look into what options may be? And when we come back to the study session, if there are any options, maybe the answer is simply no, but if there are any options, can we put those on the table at that time as well?
Thank you, Member Kay. I guess we can change the name so it's not the least worst option on the table or the best of the worst. It's the option that looks like it's going to work with the data that we have. Make it easier so that we're not adopting that in the future. Anybody else want to say anything before we talk about our special meeting? I could tell. Go ahead, Armando.
Not going to, but President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members, I still go back to, in the system that we have, everybody's fine. But what it produces, real live practitioner, what it produces is that you have some kids who are going to, we turn them into undesirables because they don't translate into the incentive monies. It's going to be expensive to educate them. And I know we can do better than that. I know we can. Anything that doesn't resolve that, I can't support. I would not support that.
Good comments. I think we all feel the same way about the incentive program. Okay, 2 weeks.
President Narducci, I took a gander at the board staff schedules, and I don't know your schedules, but I can assume that maybe Friday, April 12th would work well. We have a ton of other...
I have a Board of Regents meeting in Tucson in the morning. I could meet in the afternoon.
Most likely it would be afternoon, if possible.
Member Mack can't do it either.
Yeah. I'm at a science teachers conference.
Could you call in?
Possibly.
Is Cal still on the phone?
He needs to be there.
No? Okay.
Are there other dates? Like, I mean, if you could.
The only other option we have is April 15th, which is a Monday.
Tax day.
Yes. So make sure your taxes are done in case, before you come to that meeting.
Extensions. All around.
I thought we moved that to June 15th. If it was morning.
Morning on the 15th.
That works better for me.
15th?
Member Burton?
Burton.
I think so.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
So April 15th, 9 o'clock, special meeting.
Okay.
And then I'll write the agenda item as a presentation, discussion, and possible action. And board staff will supply all of the information that...
See, and I'm pretty sure it's not here, so I apologize if it is in one of these packets, but just more data on how that would change school grading, the same, just to get a sense of how significant this change